Hello, I'm Ben and you're watching The PhD Parent. So I'll state the obvious, every baby cries. And babies cry for a bunch of different reasons. For example, they're hungry, tired or physically uncomfortable. And sometimes they cry for no apparent reason at all. Now while every baby will cry, the amount one baby to the next cries varies a lot. Some babies don't cry that much, whereas others cry excessively. So in this video, I'm going to outline research that's examined normative patterns of crying in kids from birth to 1 year old. And I'll discuss the prevalence of excessive crying, sometimes termed colic or problematic crying. But I'll start with the assessment of crying. And there are three main ways in which patterns of infant crying have been assessed. The first has been to get parents to retrospectively report patterns of crying using a questionnaire. Now the good thing about this approach is that it's easy to deliver to a lot of people and doesn't require much effort for them to complete. The big downside is that it relies upon a person's recall of crying episodes, which may not be accurate. The second approach has involved parents keeping a 24-hour diary of their child's crying. Now there are different ways in which a diary might be implemented, but for example, the diary might be divided into 4 6-hour periods, morning, afternoon, evening, and night. And within each period, the time is divided into 5-minute blocks, and parents are required to fill in the blocks according to the behavior their infant was exhibiting. For example, awake and content versus awake and crying. The number of days parents are asked to keep a diary for varies across studies, but tends to range from 1 24-hour period up to 8 24-hour periods. Now the good thing about this approach is that it mostly gets around the problem of having parents recall crying episodes. However, it's probably very unlikely that a parent's going to be making a diary entry every 5 minutes, and so there will inevitably be some reliance on recall. And of course, having to keep a diary is more effortful compared to a questionnaire. So the third approach has been to use audio recordings. For example, I read one study where a recording device was stitched into the infant's clothing, with this recording any noise the child made for a 24-hour period. Now the good thing about this approach is that the recording strips out reliance on parental recall, and it's the most objective assessment approach of the three. However, the recording still has to be interpreted by a human listener. That is, researchers have to categorize noises as crying or whatever else, so there's still a degree of subjectivity. And while it's not a load on parents, from the researcher's point of view, it's much harder to roll this assessment approach out to a lot of people and to score the results. Some studies have used both the diary and audio recording approaches and compared the results you get with each. Across the studies, the correlation between the two assessment approaches is around 0.6 to 0.7-ish, which is considered a moderate to strong association, and has been taken as providing confidence in the validity of the diary approach. Thus, diaries have become the go-to approach for researchers. So on to research that's looked at crying patterns in kids. And I'll start with crying across the first 3 months of life. Now the reason for focusing on the first 3 months of life here is twofold. First, from what I can tell, most of the research conducted is focused on this period. And second, Woke have conducted a meta-analysis of this research, which is basically a statistical summary of the findings across studies. And so they save me the trouble of having to present every study. So here are the details of Woke. These researchers looked at 28 papers, which involved 33 samples of infants. They only looked at studies in which crying was assessed using the diary approach, given that this is considered the gold standard. The studies involved samples recruited in the USA, Canada, UK, Italy, Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, and Japan. The samples ranged in size from 12 to 1,857 infants, with about 70 infants in each study on average. Parents were required to keep diaries for between 1 to 8 days, with the most common duration being 3 days. In most studies, infants were not followed across time. Rather, they were recruited when they were X weeks old. For example, 8 weeks old or 12 weeks old or whatever. The main outcome was the average number of minutes babies fussed or cried in a 24-hour period. No definition of fussing or crying was provided, but if you look at the studies that have provided a definition, fussing is when an infant is unsettled or irritable, but not continuously crying, and crying is a longish period of distress that is vocalized. So here is what Woke found. In the first 4 weeks of life, infants cry for about 2 hours per day, with a standard deviation of about 1 hour. In weeks 5 to 6 of life, infants cry a little bit longer, about 2 hours and 15 minutes per day, again with a standard deviation of 1 hour. Then things start to get better. In weeks 8 to 9 of life, and for whatever reason there was no data for week 7, infants cry a little bit less, about 1 hour 45 minutes per day, and there was no standard deviation provided for this one. And by weeks 10 to 12 of life, infants are down to about 70 minutes of crying per day, with a standard deviation of about 45 minutes. So now on to crying from 3 months to 1 year. So I was able to find a few studies that looked at crying beyond the first few months of life. There were others I found, but I won't report them because they involved dividing up samples in ways that didn't enable a normative estimate of crying. And I'm sure there's probably some I've missed. The studies I reviewed used either a questionnaire or diary approach to assess crying. Some studies reported data specifically on crying, whereas in other studies it was crying and fussing. As you'd imagine, when data was related to crying and fussing, the estimates of how long this behaviour lasted for were longer than just crying. In the reviewed studies, it was common for researchers to lump kids into 3 age brackets: 4 to 6 months, 7 to 9 months, and 10 to 12 months. And so that's what I did too. And here are the results. So once you pass the 3-month mark, you're looking at about 35 minutes a day of crying. And while there does appear to be a bump at 7 to 9 months, this probably reflects the fact that the data the estimate was based on were all cry-fuss times, which, as mentioned, tend to be longer than crying only. Now, one thing worth mentioning is that across the studies, the times when most crying occurred tended to be in the evening. And the final thing is that the amount a kid cried appears to be dependent upon how parents responded to that crying. For example, Baldwin found that the average amount of time per day kids cried, if parents ignored them, was about 60 minutes. If parents left the kid for 5 minutes before then going to them, the average was about 30 minutes. And if they picked the kid up as soon as they started crying, then the average was only 20 minutes. So, not surprisingly, how parents respond makes a big difference to the amount of crying. So now onto prevalence of excessive crying. So as mentioned, while every baby cries, some babies cry more than others, and a proportion will be classified as excessive criers. However, there's little consensus concerning how to define excessive crying. One early definition was put forward by Wessel. According to the so-called Wessel criteria, excessive crying is when a baby cries for more than 3 hours on more than 3 days a week for a period of more than 3 weeks. However, it's argued that the Wessel criteria are impractical because of the load they'd impose on a parent. That is, having to record their kid for a 3-week period to determine whether they meet criteria for excessive crying. So the modified Wessel criteria were developed, according to which excessive crying is when a baby cries for more than 3 hours for at least 3 days a week in any given week. So according to Woke, the modified Wessel criteria is now commonly used among researchers to identify excessive crying. But it's still not the only approach. As Reijneveld point out, many other definitions of excessive crying have been used. And these include variants that specify objective time periods of crying, like the Wessel criteria, and others that are subjective, for example, parental report of simply whether the child cries a lot. The result of all of this is that rates of excessive crying differ across studies, simply as a result of the definition used. At any rate, what I'll do is look at the prevalence of excessive crying in the first 3 months using Woke's meta-analysis. And then I'll briefly touch on the prevalence of excessive crying when kids are 3 months and older. So first up, excessive crying across the first 3 months of life. So Woke used the modified Wessel criteria for determining the prevalence of excessive crying. As can be seen, in the first 4 weeks of life, close to 20% of babies cried excessively. This jumped to about 25% in weeks 5 to 6, before falling to about 10% by weeks 8 to 9, and then being close to 0 by weeks 10 to 12. The researchers also provided a rough guide for identifying excessive crying in terms of minutes of crying per 24 hours by developing a percentile chart. They suggested that kids who fell above the 90th percentile could be considered excessive criers. So, according to Woke, in the first 4 weeks of life, crying for about 200 minutes or more per 24 hours would be indicative of excessive crying. In weeks 5 to 6, this went up to about 225 minutes, down to about 180 minutes by weeks 8 to 9, and then about 135 minutes by weeks 10 to 12. However, one issue with these cutoffs is that they offer no guidance in terms of how many days the specified level of crying should occur for. For example, should it be 1 day or several? Most definitions of excessive crying require a kid to cry for a certain number of hours for a certain number of days across a certain number of weeks. It's probably not sensible to define excessive crying with respect to a single 24-hour period. We all have bad days, including babies. So if it were me, I'd be leaning towards a definition that required evidence of longevity of crying for extended periods. So I can see how these cutoffs might be integrated with the Wessel criteria. So now into excessive crying across 3 months to 1 year of life. Now here I only came across a couple of studies. Reijneveld recruited about 1,100 infants who were 6 months old, with crying assessed using a standardized parental interview. The interesting thing about this study was that they reported rates of excessive crying based upon 10 different definitions of excessive crying put forward. The rates ranged from basically 0% when the original Wessel criteria was used, up to about 8% when the criteria of my child cries a lot was used. Applying the modified Wessel criteria, as Woke did, the rates of excessive crying were about 2%. Next, St. James, Roberts and Halil also looked at the prevalence of excessive crying. And to add to the lack of consensus about the way in which excessive crying is defined, these researchers used 5 different definitions, none of which overlap with any of the 10 used by Reijneveld. The definition closest to any of Reijneveld's, and closest to the modified Wessel criteria, was at least 3 hours of crying in a 24-hour period. So using this definition, the rates of excessive crying were about 10% in both 4 to 6 month old and 7 to 9 month old kids. It then fell to about 5% in kids who were 10 to 12 months old. Now these rates are a bit higher than reasonable, but I think that simply reflects a definition of excessive crying that's much easier to meet. So definitions matter, particularly when trying to get a sense of how many kids will cry excessively. Now it's hard to get a sense of what happens once kids are older than 3 months. Either excessive crying is basically non-existent, or potentially up to 1 in 10 kids are still excessively crying. Your guess is as good as mine. Now, one final thing to talk about is the persistence of excessive crying. Wake investigated this issue in a sample of about 450 infants who were categorized according to whether or not they had a crying problem. No strict criteria was used to define what a crying problem was. It was simply based upon whether the parent thought the kid had a problem. The researchers looked at how many kids who had a crying problem when they were 2 months old still had a problem when they were 4 months old. The good news was that about 80% of kids who initially had a problem when they were 2 months old no longer had a problem when they were 4 months old. Hence, in most cases, crying problems resolved, presumably spontaneously, after a month or 2. So, for the moment, that's it for crying. If there's anything I've gotten wrong, any important research I've overlooked, or if you have any questions, then feel free to get in touch. Otherwise, happy parenting.